Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Boozer. I'm with CUGC HQ, and I'm happy to welcome you all to today's expanded user share webinar. And we're going to be talking a lot about cloud today. Very excited to get going on this. Briefly, I know you've probably all seen it, but I'll go over our agenda really quickly. We've got 3 sessions, starting with Ron Oglesby, and he will be followed by Mike Nelson and then Marius Sandbu. 3 great sessions all about things that you need to know wherever you are in getting into the cloud. So before I get to Ron, I want to just introduce who's on our call with us this morning. Ron, you probably know from Unidesk and associate him with app layering, but he is also with Citrix now and the Director of Advanced Technology, and he is going to cover the top things an admin needs to know about Citrix Cloud. Keeping an eye on the question panel for us is Sam Jacobs. He is a CTP and he is the Director of Technology Development at IPM. So please feel free to type your questions into the question box. We won't get to all of them, but we'll try to get to most of them, and either Ron will take them during the presentation or we'll save them to the end. It just kind of depends on how we go here. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things right over to you, Ron, to get us started.
Awesome. Let's go ahead and...
the screen, sorry. One sec. There you go, live TV, people. Okay.
That tells you it's a live webinar. That's all it is. All right. I'm actually glad I'm going first today. That way I don't have to follow Mike Nelson and Marius just because they're too awesome for me to try to follow with what I'm doing. I'm also glad that I get to go first today because I'm kind of looking at cloud from a different perspective, right? When we talk about like Mike and some of the other CTPs, they have a bunch of cloud experience. And when I talk about cloud, I mean, in general, the workload hosting in Azure or Amazon, or even Citrix Cloud experience, which is actually different than just the term generic cloud, which we're going to talk about a little bit. As she mentioned, I was a layering guy, an EUC guy, been doing that stuff for years, and knew some of the basics about what is Citrix Cloud, right? Just a little bit, but for years I was so focused on layering and the internals of what's going on in the operating system and applications, I wasn't doing a lot of Citrix Cloud. So at the beginning of the year, I wanted to learn some more, right? Learn some more about the architecture, learn more about just the functionality and what were the possibilities from an architectural side, where I was going to run workloads, how they're managed, what's the communication look like, things like that. And I told the folks at CUGC that I'd like to do a cloud presentation, which quite frankly would force me to start reading and watching other people's videos and presentations and whatnot. And as I kind of went through this, of course, the stuff internally at Citrix is extremely technical, right? Talking about authentication tokens within the cloud and how authentication is handled between different web services. But I wanted to take a different look at it. I actually, a few weeks back, picked out a number of CTPs that I knew had done some cloud projects, whether with Citrix Cloud or without, and just said, hey, if you were going to talk to a Citrix admin, somebody that's got a nice size on-prem environment or has been running an environment for a while, and you were going to say, hey, here's the 3 or 4 things you need to know before you get into Citrix Cloud. What are they? And it was actually really interesting to get emails back from these 7 or 8 CTPs and how broad their kind of range of knowledge was. Some thought, item X was very important. Some thought item Y was very important. And what I did was I collected their feedback into this deck. Really, these are the things that they said, if someone was coming new to Citrix Cloud, here's kind of my common questions I get, or here's what I think is important for them to know. And I collected into this deck. You'll actually see their names throughout the deck. Wherever they gave a specific recommendation, I put their name in here because it's their information. I'm just kind of imparting it to you, if you will. So with that said, we'll go ahead and we'll get started. You know, one of the first things that was brought up by a couple of them, Aaron and Mike, had said, look, you really have to explain Citrix Cloud. A lot of times when an existing environment, someone who's an existing admin with a XenApp environment or a big XenDesktop environment, or even, you know, someone that's maybe not even a Citrix customer, they might just be running a big View VDI environment, let's say, from VMware, talk about Citrix Cloud. They often think that Citrix Cloud is a DaaS model, right? That we're going to host everything for you, and it's a basically desktop as a service. And they wanted to really separate that idea so that people understood that Citrix Cloud is really about services being provided to a Citrix customer. And in Aaron's way, it's really about providing a better level of service, a better view into metrics and uses of the systems, and really doing it via a management framework that's hosted in the cloud. Mike was very pointed. He said, hey, it's not about running your workloads in the cloud, right? They might run there, but really it's a management framework. It's a hosted service. I always liked, when I first started learning about this, one of the things, if you're a share file user, or even if you're using some other type of enterprise file sync or file sharing, right, that has a management interface where you can control where storage zones are, or how sync options work, etc. I like to liken it to those share file type platforms, because all the control plane is hosted in the cloud, right? It's hosted someplace else. It's not like you're setting up a bunch of management servers and internal databases inside your data center to do file sharing across the internet. Instead, that's all hosted in the cloud, and then you as the admin say, well, where are these files? Where is this data located? Maybe it's on-prem, right? Maybe there's file shares, existing ones, and you're using some type of storage controller or storage gateway to allow access to that to your users. Maybe some of it's in the cloud. Maybe you're using an Azure setup where you're using storage there. Maybe you're using a combination, and maybe even there's some local file sync to laptops and whatnot. If you think about Citrix Cloud in that model, that's really kind of where we're at. It's about providing that management regardless of where your applications or those VDAs are actually running. And that really means Citrix Cloud is about providing services to you, to the Citrix admin. We talk about Citrix Cloud and Citrix Workspace app, which you guys saw some at Synergy. We talk about that a lot from an end user perspective, because we know that the end user is, you know, who we're in the end trying to service with their apps and access to these apps. But from an admin perspective, when we look at it from an admin perspective, it is about providing you services. Now, this is just a snapshot I literally took a couple of days ago. There's obviously more services like app layering and stuff like that. But I just took a snapshot of some of the available services that I hadn't added into one of my cloud subscriptions. And you see things like analytics and the NetScaler management and analytics, secure browser, share file, XenApp and XenDesktop service, etc. This is what it's about. It's about allowing you to manage these different components that all actually file into the workspace that your end user uses, but providing that management centrally in one location across all these different platforms, all these different services, and all the different locations that your apps, your VDAs, that kind of meat and potatoes of Windows applications, wherever they run, you're managing them from one place. Now, with that said, Mike and a couple of the other folks also pointed out that we should really clarify Citrix Cloud versus desktop as a service. And, you know, it's actually fairly easy to do that. Desktop as a service is one of the few names in IT that actually is very descriptive. You are buying a service that provides you desktops, generally on a monthly or an annual basis. The desktops themselves, those virtual machines, the software that runs in them, whether it's Windows or a VDA or other types of agents, et cetera, are all executing within an environment provided by the provider, whatever that provider is, right? They are managing it. They have SLAs, you've contracted with them. Yes, you might have some access to their tools to do things, but really they're managing it. They're providing that desktop. When we talk about Citrix Cloud and we look at that, think of it more as the hosted services side. Your environment is still your environment, whether it's on-prem or whether it's a subscription. It could be an Azure subscription, right, let's say, or it could be a combination. Maybe you have a data center and you're looking to not overbuild for DR, so you have a subscription you use for DR purposes, or maybe you're actually moving some of the workloads that you have, that you've tested and they perform well, hey, into a cloud model. In that case, Citrix is providing the management tools and infrastructure and reporting and data collection and all of that around the infrastructure pieces of a typical Citrix environment. Now, in a little bit, we're going to jump over to a slide where we're going to talk about what really changes if you're kind of an on-prem admin. But this is the thing to know is Citrix Cloud, when we talk about it, doesn't mean all of a sudden Ron's taken over your desktops and they're moved into some odd subscription that you have no access to. You just go to some URL and they're there, like kind of an Amazon Workspaces thing, if you will. It's really supplying tools for your existing environment or the environment you're building. Now, some people ask, well, wait a minute, doesn't Citrix Cloud, isn't, the XenDesktop Essentials, XenApp Essentials, what used to be called Express, isn't that part of the cloud services? Yeah, that we could say that's a cloud service. It's obviously not core. When you look in your Citrix Cloud portal and you're going through your available tiles and all that, this was really our partnership with Microsoft in replacing their Azure remote app. And that is actually very much a DaaS play, right? You get a management console. The VMs are hosted in Azure. It's maybe not as deeply managed as you would picture some DaaS providers who do everything from, patching your antivirus, updating your antivirus, patching the OS, right? And they maintain tight control on the actual images. It can be different, right? Azure remote app and even our replacement of that, which was our Essentials product, is a little bit different, but it is still, that is kind of a DaaS offering, if you will. Now we got that out of the way. Let's say you decide, or you've been told, hey man, we should be looking at Citrix Cloud. And generally as an admin, and when I was working in environments, one of the things I always wanted to know when implementing a new software or a new management framework, or even a new internal process or policy, was how does this affect my existing environment, right? Is my environment perfect? No, I've got, this piece isn't clustered and I really have to do something about that. And this hardware that's hosting X is a little bit old and I've got to do something about that. But it's my environment and I know it well and I know where everything's at. And this is kind of a quick snapshot of your existing environment, right? We've got our DDCs. We've got them set up. We know how they work. We know how they function. We know how our zones are configured. I've got my net scalers. I've got my storefront finally working the way I want. Active Directory, of course. And then I've got my backend database that I've clustered. And I finally got the DBAs to do things the way I wanted, et cetera, et cetera. What changes if I was to implement Citrix Cloud in this type of environment? Well, today, think about it. You're kind of responsible for all this, right? Whether it's the SQL database on the back end or storage for your VDAs, right? If you're running VMs, now you're interacting with the storage team. You have to deal with your storefront servers. You have to patch everything. You have to keep everything up to date. Oh no, a new version of SQL came out. Does Citrix support that yet for, this version that I'm running, et cetera? You're managing everything, or at least touching everything. With Citrix Cloud, what changes in your environment is essentially a delineation, a logical line, if you will, represented here by that red line, that allows us to kind of forklift or take some of that work and some of the components that would have had to reside in your environment, whether it's on-prem or in a subscription, into Citrix Cloud. In this case, we drop what's called cloud connectors. They're kind of called cloud proxies. They were called edge servers at one point. But at this point, we replaced the DDCs with these cloud connectors that allow all the functionality of the DDCs, the database, all that stuff to be hosted in our cloud, in our subscriptions. Now, we'll use those connectors, that cloud connector, to still connect to your Active Directory, still talk to your hypervisors and your individual VDAs through that cloud connector. And we also offer, of course, NetScaler as a service and Storefront. Now, you can still host these things locally if you want. You can still host Storefront locally if you want. We'll hit a couple of those in a second. But what this really allows you to do is you focus on your apps and your VDAs. You make sure they're up to date. You handle, what's important to you and what you know, and allow us to deal with the updates to delivery controller software, maintaining the databases, all that stuff on the back end. I see someone has asked a question with cloud, can you still use PFS or are you limited to MCS? And I actually have a slide just on that, so I'll hit that in a little bit. So this one came from Carl Stallhood. He said, where's the data? Where is the app data? VDAs need to live where the application data lives. Now, this is interesting because this is a general cloud concept, not so much a Citrix Cloud concept. And what we have here is kind of a happy user who's talking to his VDA that's living in your data center that is, feet away from their backend data, whether that's a file server or, some type of database or something else. But when you move that VDA, if you go to a model where you're hosting your VDAs in the cloud, where is the data going to live? Have you moved that data into that cloud also, or are we making a connection over the pipe, over some distance, introducing latency, et cetera, from that VDA back to your data center? If that's the case and the users are now connecting to that VDA, we may actually have a performance issue that's not a quote-unquote Citrix performance issue, but actually the application and waiting for data sets or even files to return from requests that are going back across some network connection that's fairly long, high latency versus what they used to be, which was in the data center connected to the backbone. Carl points this out because it oftentimes the use of cloud as a host for VDAs or anything else, oftentimes the data piece is overlooked. It's like, someone in our chain of command could say, oh yeah, well, I've been talking to Citrix or whatever provider, and they said, just put it up in there. It'll be awesome, right? You can move desktops up in there. It works fine. And it does, but it's about the interaction with the data. So one of the things when you're planning, if you're planning to use cloud, not just Citrix Cloud, but any cloud to host VDAs, make sure that you're also taking into account every piece of data that VDA is going to hit, right? It could be from the authentication when they first sign in, right? Now, do I have domain controllers and domain access nearby in the same subscription in the cloud? To loading profiles, to accessing file shares via, login scripts that we all have, these historically kind of held over login scripts that map drives. Where are those file servers located? And then, of course, the individual applications. Where are their databases? What type of connections are they using, et cetera? This is all things that have to be planned for. Another big thing that came up, and this came from Christian, was to ensure that you're building scale and high availability or redundancy into your actual connectors. Now, I have a link at the bottom of this because I credit Christian with mentioning this. He actually had it in an article. And there's a Citrix Cloud scaling doc that I've got down at the bottom where we've done testing and have some recommendations on the cloud connectors. These cloud connectors essentially replace your DDCs on-prem. Your VDAs actually talk to these connectors. They act as a proxy to send that information, like VDA registration information, right, when they power up, off to the DDC service that's on the back end in Citrix Cloud. Now, you're going to need a minimum of 2 connectors, obviously, in each location. Now, this location could be your physical data center, or it could be a specific subscription. So if you're running multiple data centers, or you're running a data center and a subscription in Azure, let's say, that you're going to split some of your VDAs off. You're always going to want to have two. And when running, of course, in the data center or in these different subscriptions, you want to think about the failure domains that these connectors are in, right? I don't want both of my connectors, if I use an on-prem example, both of my connectors sitting on the same storage volume, running on the same, let's say, vSphere or Xen server host, that a simple network failure or a server purple screen or a loss of that storage volume can bring down all of my connectors, right? We want to spread those apart. Of course, in like Azure, those are called availability sets, right? You want to split them across different availability sets. The optimal config for these is 3 VMs. And when you look in that doc, the reason they talk about 3 is this is a fairly sizable, right? They were actually looking at desktops, desktop VDAs on Windows 10, about 5,000 of them. And what you want to do is you run 4 CPU VMs. They can be 4 or 8 gig of memory, probably 8 gig. And these will work up to 5,000 workstation VDAs in a single zone and still account for failure. So even if you lose number 3 of the connectors, the other 2, you will notice no performance degradation at that point because those other 2 will handle the 5,000 connections just fine. The other thing I like to point out is that the network connection that takes you outbound to your network, it's what is actually these connectors are using to talk to Citrix Cloud. There is a local host cache or a local server cache that can be enabled to allow for if that network connection goes down, you know, these essentially connectors can still replace or store some of that local information to deal with small network failures and whatnot. But of course, a best practice is to always have not just putting thought into the connector redundancy, but also putting thought into that network connection redundancy, right? Different ends of the data center, potentially going to different POPs, et cetera, to allow you to fail over and have high availability. So for the connectors themselves, this from Marius, don't install anything else on the cloud connector. The software, the actual connector software we deploy is kind of self-managed. Can you put antivirus and stuff on it? Of course you can, but you don't want this server doing a bunch of other operations. You'll notice in the previous slide that I said the connector VM should be 4 virtual CPUs. These are really CPU bound, right? The transactions, especially during peak login times, hit the CPU more than they hit memory, which is why we don't want to have these connectors doing other operations that might, you know, throw a bunch of load at the CPU also when you have peak login time and slow down everything from VDA registrations to, you know, enumeration of what VDA the user's getting routed to. Once you get the connector software on, you're going to want to set up your antivirus and proxy exceptions. These are all set up. We actually have a document that you can just follow to set these up. It's, you know, not unheard of for security to go through and do an audit and change proxy settings or sometimes change firewall rules or something. You want to make sure that the teams around you are aware of what these servers are doing and what ports they're going in and out of. The cloud connector, you have to have a cloud connector for each AD domain. So if you're running multiple domains within your environment, it's a good idea to have a connector for each one. So if I've got 2 different domains, I'm probably going to want to have a redundant pair pointed at each domain. And of course, the stable internet connection. You'll see I got a link down there. This actually came from Marius. It's got some gotchas. It's, you know, it's not brand new document, but it's still fairly up to date. Something you can keep an eye on. Patrick sent this one in, the "not my problem" quote. He actually titled his section here when he sent it to me, and I've paraphrased some of what he sent as "not my problem." Let someone else run and be responsible for all that other stuff. This is actually, it's always appealed to me. Early in my IT days, I was a control freak about everything, to the point of even when I was first getting into virtualization and doing the early ESX stuff, I bought my own storage array internally that, you know, other people didn't touch, so I could have full control of everything from my HBA queue depths on the server all the way to the way the LUNs were designed. But what I've learned over time is that the storage guys were actually way better at storage than I was if I communicated what my needs were to them. And that's what I'm kind of seeing when I look at Citrix Cloud as the services it's going to provide. Let them host the database. No more will your, DBA update or make a change to the SQL box and drop your connections, right? Let them update the delivery controllers. Now, when I'm updating things, I've already got the VDA updates that I'm trying to deal with, and I've got a lot of internal stuff already going on. I can just let my DDCs self-update. They're all up in the cloud. They're being handled. And of course, these things apply to storefront, director, license servers, all now no longer running in your environment and hosted someplace else, allowing you to focus on, what's really important, which are those applications. Now, of course, this removes infrastructure from your environment. If you start to move this out, these requirements out, and someone else is handling those as a service for you, well, you no longer have those VMs to patch. You no longer have those OSs to patch, right? When you're dealing with internal failure domains and trying to move from rack to rack because hardware is now depreciated, you're no longer thinking about these VMs at all. They're gone. If you are looking at updates and you're upgrading, let's just say XenApp, right? A new rev comes out and, it's got these 3 fixes I've got to have. It removes a lot of time and complexity from that process. You know that the back end infrastructure is already set up. It's already running. They're doing their updates. You're again focusing on those end nodes, the VDAs and all of that. Eric sent this one. Do I save money going to the cloud? I don't think he actually phrased it that way. I think he said you don't necessarily save money going to the cloud. This was one of his things for Citrix admins to know. And it's really about, you might not save money in the way that you think. Most of us as IT folks, especially internal IT folks, we've been trained to think about CapEx. We deal with it constantly, right? Servers cost so much. Each network port costs so much. If we need to expand and add new racks, et cetera, those are all CapEx costs that then go into a depreciation schedule, et cetera, et cetera. Buying services in a lot of cases moves the money. It moves it from CapEx to OpEx, which sometimes in our world, in IT, our budgets don't account for that. Right? Sure, we do have some OpEx spend, and our CFOs and any finance folks on the IT side, they understand all the differences, but a lot of times, most of us are tuned into the CapEx problem where we're going and asking for additional servers or network ports or a storage upgrade, and they're looking straight at CapEx costs. We're moving it from one side of the ledger or from one column in the ledger to another, from a CapEx to an operational expense. But really, cloud is about reducing management time. And this is a lot harder to quantify, right? It's harder to quantify with the boss that the DBA will no longer have 10 hours this year dealing with your Citrix database. The network guys won't have X number of hours dealing with the network equipment or NetScalers when you do your upgrades or you need them to upgrade something. It allows us to focus on more important tasks, more things that are important to the end user, but it's very, very hard to quantify in those softer areas. The other problem that admins often run into is what I call the sunk cost problem. They have servers, they have hardware, they have racks, right? Networks, everything is already set up. Those are what's called a sunk cost, already spent money. And what a lot of times when an admin sees Citrix Cloud or some other cloud type service that they want to get into that they're sort of doing or already have on-prem, even with all the other benefits, the better metrics, the better upgrades, all that fun stuff, one of the things they get pushed back on is that, well, we already have that internally and it's not off the depreciation schedule yet. There's no really great way to solve that, right? If I just bought a bunch of hardware 6 months ago, and the first thing I do propose to my boss is to, I don't need a tenth of this hardware anymore because I want to go to Citrix Cloud. Well, that hardware is already on the depreciation schedule, right? It's only 6 months old. We might as well leverage it, et cetera, et cetera. But it's something for you to be aware of as an argument that might come up against something like the cloud. My response have always been to that is it's still capacity. If I have compute and memory and networking available here, just because I'm moving some services in the cloud and getting better SLAs, et cetera, I still now have that capacity I'm freeing up for those DDCs and license servers and storefront and all that. I still have that extra capacity that I can use to give my users better performance without any additional costs on the CapEx side. And remember, Citrix Cloud is not hosting the VDAs, right? The big thing when we talk about hosting VDAs and the cost associated with it is they're pretty significant costs when you go to straight desktop as a service. It's not to say it's bad or good, it's just a different cost above Citrix Cloud because you're hosting, right? You're actually paying for that compute time for those VMs and the storage to run someplace else versus on-prem. But what the nice thing is that you can start leveraging some of those cloud services, whether it's your own subscription, where you're only getting charged for when something is running. This is actually really good for environments that have to have rapid expansion, such as, you know, hey, during Christmas time, our point of sale systems are ramping up. We hire 30% more staff from, you know, Thanksgiving to Christmas, and I need 30% more capacity. If you're all on-prem, you've got to build in overcapacity for that. If you have an Azure subscription with a few templates in it, you can spin it up and only pay for it while it's actually running. So there are some cost savings here and there.
Ron, we've had a few questions about the upgrade process. Do we have time for?
Oh, yeah, I guess.
Okay. So what kind of notifications do you receive when a server is upgraded?
A server like down in your data center?
No, what one of these servers on Citrix Cloud itself in the back?
Oh, well, those are they're transparent to you, right? So the first thing to note is when you think about Citrix Cloud, don't think about it as a series of servers. I know we kind of oversimplify this sometimes. Are there components that are running as unique VM instances in our cloud for a customer? Yes. We have a couple of components that are still unique to each customer, running in an isolated subscription just for them. But then the vast majority of components are actually larger web services. I say larger, and then I want to use the word discrete. They're discrete web services that are multi-tenant and allow, you know, that service to provide data in and data out and authentication, all that stuff for your environment in a multi-tenant aware configuration. So what that means to you is it's transparent, right? We update components in Citrix Cloud every couple of weeks, right? We might be updating the DDC functionality. We might be updating the license server functionality. And of course, when we build these, whether they're the web services that are multi-tenant or whether they're some of the discrete services that are running unique for each customer, we automatically build them redundantly and spread them around. So don't think of it as like a server is upgraded, right? We're always updating services. And a good example of this is something like Salesforce, right? They're really good from a public understanding of back-end web services, right? They have a million different services. They offer all types of stuff, right? But they're constantly upgrading and changing code to fix bugs, add functionality, et cetera. And you'll be notified of added functionality and new changes when updates come. But it's not like, hey, we updated a server, because really all we're doing is changing these services and everything's built in a redundant fashion. Now, there is a monthly uptime SLA that's 99.9%, I believe, which is about 30 minutes a month that we target for upgrades, right? We have kind of a window that you get notified of and whatnot. But don't think of it like a server, right? It's not like we took your SQL database and you're used to running it in a cluster there, and now it's just running in our cloud, and we're going to notify you that we're rebooting the the SQL cluster like you would have got from your DBA. In our case, it's a resilient database, and you'll never notice when that code change happens.
Is Citrix, is it running in Azure or AWS, or does it have its own proprietary cloud?
Oh, yeah, good question. So the Citrix Cloud runs in Azure, and it's actually, from an individual customer perspective, the best way to view it is that the cloud services you're being provided are really coming out of kind of two subscriptions. One is the greater Citrix Cloud subscription, where a lot of these web services and our authentication and security, all that kind of back end stuff happens. This is kind of the larger subscription. And then for a customer, there's a discrete subscription set up that we set up and handle that manages or hosts a few of these VMs that are unique to that customer. Now, they don't have to manage those VMs. They don't even know what they are. All they know is, they go to, citrix.cloud.com. They sign in and they can see all their stuff. But yeah, it's all hosted in Azure right now. Now, that doesn't mean you can't talk to other subscriptions from other providers, but we host ours in Azure.
What about security for Citrix Cloud?
Oh, that's a big question.
Yeah.
That's like what about security at the Defense Logistics Agency? It has all their computers unplugged today. That's a bigger question. Because it's like, well, what does that mean? Is it roles and rights within the administrative interface? Is it, security boundaries? What do we do? Internally, when Citrix Cloud itself was designed and we start designing these web services and we started moving some of the functionality that you guys see in things like the DDC or the license server or whatever into these web services that you don't see, you just interact with. Security was kind of paramount because what we're doing is, from your subscription, we're talking to Active Directory, your Active Directory. You can then see your users and assign user accounts to, specific functions and whatnot. But also when we send a command or when you initiate some admin function that sends a command to the back end somewhere, we have to do that securely, right? So there's a whole architecture around authentication and passing those security tokens from one web service to another to make sure, and that's kind of just to make sure everything's secure and done correctly, but that's kind of just foundational to any multi-tenant environment. It's the kind of the same authentication models and security token models you see in, like I said before, Salesforce, which is a great example. As you move between different functions, there's still an overarching security model that handles authentication and passing this authentication from one module to another.
Okay. When we get back to the presentation, we'll get to some more questions.
Yeah, later. Great. The other thing that I wanted to point out, and Carl pointed this out, is that most new features, and I'm going to talk about Storefront for a second, most new features are introduced in Citrix Cloud first. Remember when I said that, we're updating code every couple of weeks, right? We're constantly making sure, bug fix, change for this. Oh, we found a security fix. Let's put that in place. We're constantly updating that. And we're doing this in what's called a Scrum model or an Agile development model, which allows us to do 2 or 3 week sprints of code development and updates and roll them in, right? Do our QA, do our tests, roll them in. This means that a lot of times new functionality is all going to show up in Citrix Cloud first. So when we talk about the new Workspace app, right, that's replacing Receiver, this idea that we can aggregate the workspace and third-party SaaS apps and all this other fun stuff that's going to be pumped into whether it's your desktop or your phone or whatever, that functionality is based around Citrix Cloud, and you're going to see those things hit there first. You'll also see this with Storefront and some other technologies. Now, of course, Carl pointed out that you can still, even if using Citrix Cloud, host Storefront yourself internally. And sometimes in big existing environments with custom storefront setups and multiple data centers, they go, hey, we're going to keep hosting Storefront ourselves. And that's fine. The connectors, our cloud connectors are fine with that. But removing it out of there, again, is one less thing that you're patching and managing and dealing with. And your users just go to a URL and off you go. It's actually very simple. We go back to one of those questions I saw. I heard I can't use PVS with Citrix Cloud. And I always tell people, well, PVS is not available for the cloud today, but it works fine with Citrix Cloud. Hey, what? If you think about PVS itself, right, it's heavy network streaming. It's unbelievably heavy network streaming. It's very efficient. It's as efficient as you can be, but the way it works is not like MCS or even like some of the other models out there, View Composer, which are essentially cloning VMs or doing some type of disk image sharing at the VM level. PVS, there's a central server, there's a PVS store. You're using some type of remote boot technology. There's a couple different options, right? And then it's streaming the OS into that VM. Well, on Azure and different cloud networks, PVS isn't really set up for that, right? It was set up to have high-speed network connections, very redundant. Anyone that knows PVS knows that network is key. So what do I mean it works with Citrix Cloud? Well, you can still run PVS in your on-prem environment. The PVS server, the PVS servers, the database, the store, they can stay local on-prem. And the Citrix Cloud connector can allow you, when you're running the management interface, to still, deal with it. It's fine. You can still assign PVS images and hook them up to the device collections that are going to specific delivery groups, machine catalogs and delivery groups. That's all fine. It's going to be, PVS is going to be a local on-prem provisioning model versus MCS, which is what you're going to use in the cloud, right? When people talk about PVS in the cloud, it's generally about running those workloads in the cloud. If you have an Azure subscription, you're right. We're going to use MCS in Azure because we're going to use the Azure templates, and we're going to have MCS use Azure templates to go out and spin off additional VMs. All right, a couple more slides here. Almost done, almost wrapping up. Carl and Marius both pointed this out in their email responses to me, that the Citrix Cloud ICA proxy is included with your subscription, right? Some of you are using ICA proxies via the NetScalers. You might have actual NetScalers on-prem, but even getting a subscription to Citrix Cloud to run your XenApp or XenDesktop environment includes the ICA proxy. You want that NetScaler gateway ICA proxy wherever your VDAs are located. So this typically is appliances in the data center, but you can also let us host the ICA proxies because we have ICA proxies that are available in POPs all over. I think it was 18 of them, I want to say, all over the world. And it will go back through the cloud connector. So remember, we talk about those cloud connectors that are sitting in your data center that are kind of forwarding information onto the DDC services on the back end. This same thing can happen with the ICA proxies. We can leverage cloud-based ICA proxies, get the benefits of that performance, and we'll actually route it through those cloud connectors that are already in your data center, no additional infrastructure, et cetera, and get you that performance bump there. All right, this one was from Mike Nelson, and I wanted to hit on this. I'm actually going to move this aside. I got something on my other screen where I'm trying to look at the questions and talk to you guys and all that at once. He said that even knowing the difference between Citrix Cloud and just Cloud or DAS, the other thing that if you're moving to this model is to have an understanding of the various models and nomenclature of cloud infrastructure. Each provider uses different terminology, right? There's a lot of cross terminology, obviously, but they do use different terminology. The way they handle resource consumption, licensing of VMs, it all varies between which provider you're going to pick, whether it's Amazon or Microsoft or Google or whoever. Underestimating how licensing and this resource consumption model works is one of the biggest hits new cloud users take. I remember even when we did it, and we first started doing a lot of stuff in Azure a couple of years ago when I was at Unidesk, we got our first or second month's bill and we just couldn't believe it because we had so many things running, they didn't need to be running, et cetera. We didn't understand the consumption model yet. We had to wrap our minds around that. The other thing to note is subscription limits. We bumped into this a number of times because we would be doing so much automated QA, and we were actually very heavy on the disk because we were doing this disk compiling and copying things, et cetera, that we would bump into subscription limits on the storage side. We had used too many IO, or we had transferred too much data. So you got to understand those subscription limits and what happens when you bump into them so that you can say, no, I need more. How do I request more? It's not that Microsoft says you can't have more, or Amazon or Google. It's that your subscription and the level you're paying at might limit you in some fashion. And of course, user expectations are key. Running things in the cloud, sometimes expectations have to be set properly. And you guys know this probably just from migrating within your own data center from one type of platform to another. I've seen places where the workloads and the apps are, they're going from some older hardware into a cloud model. The actual execution of the app locally is faster, but they're going to a different website, right? Or they're going to a different interface, and it takes 3 seconds more or 5 seconds more or whatever. Any change to the user seems wrong, right? Human nature sees that difference in time. And sometimes if you just set expectations, hey, we're changing the website, this changes also. This is faster, but this is a little slower. Sometimes just setting expectations reduces the number of incoming support calls and, of course, pushback you get from those end users. All right, let's get my mouse back over here. There we go. And this was from Eric again. Lab time / training. His big thing is that it is a significant change to go from an on-prem admin to a cloud or hybrid admin. It literally is, you want to say night and day. That makes it seem very bleak, but it literally is a change in terminology and a change in processes. Right, the interfaces that you're using might be different. Maybe you've been a XenApp customer running on vSphere with EMC storage for the last 5 years, and you've started to do this cloud thing. Well, there's no vCenter in, let's say, Azure or Amazon or Google, right? How you deploy a template changes, how you set up a network changes, some of the networking definitions change. And so learning these new concepts and language, if you will, learning to speak that new language, it does take a little bit of time. This means that managers, for any IT managers on the phone, or those of you who are proposing a project, when you're proposing them to your manager, you need to budget time and training dollars for lab workloads. Actually put in some dollars to say, we're going to have a lab, kind of a lab subscription, or an area within an existing subscription that these admins can go in and test functions. How do I clone this piece of storage from here to here? I used to just go into, Zen Server or vSphere, and I just right click and I could copy. How do I do it here? Wait a minute, these network options are weird. I don't understand. I read the paper that described these 3 networking options. Why don't I just set them up between 2 VMs and try these 3 different networking options so I understand them and the language again becomes clear? And so you got to actually test these changes, see how they fit into your existing processes. You got to learn how to manage all this kind of new logical infrastructure. And of course, all of your existing workflows are, they can change. So how do we validate what we know now for workflows and run books and move them into this big difference? Jumping right into production with a subscription is generally not the way to go, right? It's kind of like you set up an environment, it's in dev, and tomorrow it's production. We all know how that goes. This can be even worse because in that environment, you at least know every component and you can speak the language. In a cloud environment, if you're shifting to a cloud subscription model, the language is even different. You don't even know the question to ask. What does this do? You don't even know what quote unquote this is until you've learned it a little bit. Big failing that, I can't push enough. I'm a big believer in training and lab environments and understanding what cloud looks like when you move to it is just a huge, huge thing. All right, final slide. I'm going to end this with a quote. This is actually, for those that aren't from the United States, Benjamin Franklin might not be as famous outside the United States, but he was one of our founders in our country, and he had an interesting quote that said, all of mankind is divided into three classes: those that are movable, those that are immovable, and those who move. And really what he was trying to say is that, you know, the immovable people are ones who can't be convinced to change anything, ever. There's nothing you can say, no benefit you can show them, and they will never acquiesce to anything that you suggest. The movable are the people that can see that change and new benefits, they could do something, and they're at least willing to listen and maybe be convinced that your change you're proposing is correct. And of course, the movers, the ones that move, they lead in everything. They're the ones that are constantly on the look for those new technologies and bringing them forth and showing them to people. And really, cloud is you know, a couple of years ago, it was about the movers. In the last few years, it started to become about the movable. And, you know, from my perspective, and this is just a tech geek perspective, is I always like to be one of the movers, and hopefully this presentation has helped you guys out a little bit. And Sam, that was my last slide.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions. I just wanted to make a point. If we don't get all the questions answered in this session, there are 2 more sessions following this, and your question might get answered in that session. And also, I believe, Stephanie, correct me if I'm wrong, that if there are any outstanding questions, they can be answered and after the seminar.
Yeah, I'll send out the questions that don't get answered today. I'll try to get those answered offline, and in the follow-up email that you guys will all get, there'll be a link to the forum thread for this event at mycgc.org, and we'll put all that in that thread, so you'll be able to see it that way.
Okay, great. So Ron, going back to your slide that had the VDA separate from the data. So one of the questions was, will ExpressRoute help in that case if the VDA and data are separate?
Sure. Yeah, ExpressRoute can help it, right? Whenever you're looking at ExpressRoute versus just, I hate to say it, traversing the plain old internet to a public IP or whatever, yeah, ExpressRoute can help it. It depends on what level you're paying for and what really the application requires. And I'll give you an example. If my VDA was today sitting on a server connected via 1 gig or 10 gig, literally 1 switch or 2 switch hops away from a file server, and I go to open these files that are gigabits large, that probably still isn't going to perform as well in a situation where the VDA is in the cloud and I have an ExpressRoute connection back to the network, you know, somewhere in a different city, or, you know, whatever. The number of network hops and everything still impact it. Would you notice a difference? We used to use ExpressRoute at Unidesk. Would you notice a difference for things that are pretty lightweight on the data side? Yeah, to a user, right? We might be able to actually measure a difference from the network perspective, and from an IT perspective, we might be able to say, oh, this was, you know, when we did this type of operation to that data, it was, you know, 82 milliseconds to return it, or it was 150 milliseconds, or whatever it was. Where we're now, when we do it over ExpressRoute, it's 200. Right? Does someone notice a 50 millisecond difference? Do they notice a 100 millisecond difference in, you know, inside an app when it's pulling a specific set of data? Hard to tell, right? But it's still a network, right? We still have to deal with the mathematical reality there that data has to transit a wire somewhere, and when it comes down to it, latency in gigabytes or latency in bandwidth still really means something.
Right. A cloud connector, when a cloud connector automatically updates, if it fails, will it cause any problems to any connections that are currently going through the connector?
If it fails, it could, right? I mean, the idea that the cloud connectors self-update, one of the reasons that you want to have multiple is it's not like we're load balancing between them. It's not like, you know, an active passive cluster where an active TCP connection through connector A automatically gets moved over to connector B, right? The updates, if I remember correctly, and I may be misspeaking, again, I'm not a cloud expert, but if I remember right, before we do the update, we're shutting down connections, right? We're disabling connections through that so that it gets updated and then the other one gets updated, at least if I remember right. I could be completely wrong though, Sam.
Yep. Yeah, I forgot there's a name for that process. I forgot what it is.
I forgot it too, yeah. And,
yeah.
You know, that's what you get when you get a newbie.
Yes, one of the somebody on the webinar said that it happened to him that it failed and he couldn't connect to the on-premise resources for a week, and it eventually removed the resource domain from the control plane. So
did he not have a redundant one? That'd be always my question, right? If you're losing a resource domain or a resource location from Citrix Cloud, yeah, it'll time out after a while. If those connectors, I had a connector that I had just shut off and I forgot about, and eventually, of course, I lost that resource location. But if I had redundant ones, because let's say it wasn't a lab, it was real, I should have had redundant ones. Shutting off one of them should have still established connection through the other one. They still do, you know, they still do that logic to make sure. That's why you want to have 2 or 3 of them.
Cool. Another good question, is multi-tenancy supported by Citrix Cloud within one Citrix service provider subscription?
I don't know about the Citrix service provider subscriptions. You know, my look at this has all, you know, in leading up to this presentation has all been from a straight customer's perspective. I do know that there are certain functions. The reason we have that kind of separate isolated subscription for a couple of functions for each customer is because there are some things that today the web service isn't designed for yet, and those for security reasons, those couple of functions need to be in an isolated subscription for each customer. So I'm not sure if the CSP model is completely different there. I would assume it isn't, but that just means that as the CSP spins up individual customers, they don't have to think about it. We go ahead and we would set up a unique discrete subscription for each one of those customers to host these services that we haven't moved into the multi-tenant world yet.
Yeah, okay. He said that he did have 2 cloud connectors, but okay. Okay, I guess.
I think we are at 11 or noon, depending on where you are in the U.S.
Yep.
I appreciate the chance to present, guys. Thanks a lot, Sam, for keeping me honest, and thanks everyone for being on this user share.
All right, back to you, Stephanie.
Thank you. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Sam. We are going to take a quick little break, and we'll be back in about 5 minutes with Mike Nelson. So just stay tuned. We'll be back in just a few moments.